The first thing he registered upon opening his eyes was the scent of iron and disinfectant clinging to the opulent rug. A man named Caleb was pinned to the floor, his body a roadmap of dried blood and fresh wounds. Some cuts were so deep they revealed the glint of bone beneath, a testament to the previous owner of this body's profound hatred for him. He was supposed to be dead, finally free after a decade chained to a hospital bed. Instead, he was here, inhabiting the body of Julian Thorne, a notoriously cruel heir with a constitution as fragile as spun glass. His only way out, the book had promised, was to die at Caleb's hand. And Caleb, the story's protagonist, was currently under his expensive leather shoe. A tremor ran through the man's body, a quiet testament to the pain. Julian's own leg twitched, an involuntary spasm that drove his heel deeper into a fresh wound. Caleb's eyes, cold enough to promise 1,000 violent deaths, flickered up to meet his. A slow, cruel smile spread across Julian's face as he deliberately increased the pressure. He hadn't been looking for death, not anymore, but if this was the only exit, he was more than willing to take it. He surveyed the scene with a detached curiosity, marveling at Caleb's stoicism. The man hadn't made a sound. A true protagonist, built of steel and resolve. Julian had always been a sucker for that kind of strength. He briefly worried if he'd have the heart to follow through with the plan. Other transmigrators got systems or secret powers. He got a terminal diagnosis and a brain addled by years of painkillers. He shifted his weight, using the toe of his shoe to tilt Caleb's chin up, demanding he raise his head. Caleb obeyed, his gaze level, a terrifying calm mixed with a reckless, untamed defiance. His eyes scanned Julian for a fraction of a second before dismissing him entirely. Julian felt a familiar spark of rage ignite. He had spent years in a bed, enduring the pitying, dismissive glances of doctors and family. That look, the one that saw him as nothing more than a fragile inconvenience, was something he would not tolerate. He stood, grabbing a fistful of Caleb's sweat-matted hair and yanking his head back. He demanded to know who gave him permission to use such a look. Caleb's voice was a raw rasp, apologizing, calling him sir. Julian's gaze was glacial. He turned to Leo, his personal assistant, and asked what Caleb's transgression had been. Leo reported that Caleb had shattered the young master's signed Tiffany vase. Julian let out a cold scoff, remembering it was a personal gift from Senator Harrison. He remarked on Caleb's audacity. Caleb, still pinned beneath Julian's foot, trembled slightly, but his eyes were like deep, dark pools. He denied the accusation. Julian asked for proof, knowing full well the man couldn't provide any. The vase was likely still pristine in the estate's vault. After a tense silence, Caleb's lips twisted into a faint, mocking smile. He wondered aloud why Julian was so hesitant today, questioning if his master hated him or, perhaps, harbored a different kind of feeling. A chill went down Julian's spine. The protagonist was perceptive. Julian's sole desire was to be killed by him, to finally escape this cycle of sickness. Antagonizing Caleb was the most direct path. He pressed down harder, his voice a low murmur, telling the man not to overthink. He was merely contemplating a punishment severe enough to teach him to hold his tongue. Since Caleb was in such a hurry, Julian decided on the bullwhip from the stables. They were, after all, old friends. The bullwhip was a custom piece, designed to flay skin from muscle, leaving wounds that would fester for weeks. As expected, a dangerous light flared in Caleb's eyes, his gaze locking onto Julian with predatory intensity. Julian leaned down, patting the man's cheek, and asked softly if he still thought him hesitant. Caleb let out too low, soft chuckles, his voice eerily calm. He thanked Julian for the gift, promising he would remember his master's kindness. Even after Caleb was dragged away, the feeling of his stare lingered like a physical touch. Julian's frail body swayed, and Leo rushed to support him, suggesting a hydrotherapy session. For the first time, Julian felt a pure, undiluted killing intent directed at him. His mind, warped by a decade of agony, found the sensation not terrifying, but exhilarating. A thrill shot through him, making his fingertips tremble. He had to clench his fists to keep from laughing aloud. Submerged in the warm, herb-infused water of the therapy pool, Julian let out a sigh of contentment. The original Julian, for all his weakness, was staggeringly wealthy. The pool was a custom installation designed to soothe his chronic pain and fortify his fragile system. This body was the product of a twisted upbringing. A dead mother, a neglectful father. The boy had channeled his pain into cruelty, abusing the staff with beatings and punishments that were a regular occurrence. When Caleb's family fell from grace, Julian had taken him in, not out of kindness, but to have a new, more resilient toy to break. He had subjected Caleb to relentless torment, playing an essential role in forging the hero's dark resolve. Julian knew the story well. Once Caleb regained his power, the first person he would eliminate was the original Julian, dismembering him and letting him be dragged to death by horses. The old him would have been horrified, but the old him was gone, buried under years of wishing for an end. He was tired. He had no energy left to be a good person. Leo gently sponged his back, muttering angrily about Caleb's audacity and his threatening words. Julian, eyes closed in blissful warmth, dismissed it. Caleb never saw himself as a servant. That's why he dared to speak that way. It was strange, though. Most men would be bedridden for a month after a session with that whip, yet Caleb was always back on his feet in a few days. Julian shook his head with a small smile, remarking that Caleb was different from other men. He was far more handsome. Leo hesitated, expressing his unease about keeping Caleb around. He mentioned the look in Caleb's eyes today, comparing it to a wolf watching its prey. Julian laughed it off. An unruly dog just needed proper training. He instructed Leo to bring Caleb to him the next day. It was time the man learned how to properly serve his master. In the days that followed, Julian dedicated himself to the role of a villain. He was a poisonously cruel master, finding fault in everything Caleb did, resorting to insults and blows at the slightest provocation. Caleb took it all without a word, his expression unreadable. But then new things began to happen. A long needle was found under Julian's pillow. A fine, gritty powder that smelled of almonds was discovered at the bottom of his morning tea. They were methods designed not for a quick death, but for prolonged agony. Caleb was a man of brutal efficiency. If he wanted someone dead, they wouldn't see the next sunrise. This was different. This was deliberate torment. He wasn't just enduring the abuse, he was returning it in kind, playing a game of his own. The realization made Julian laugh with a bitter humor. Before he could devise a new punishment, Caleb created a much larger problem. A simple errand to a downtown bakery to pick up some macarons somehow ended with him offending the son of Senator Harrison. Leo helped Julian out of the town car, complaining about the risk to his master's health. Julian, weakened by a recent bout of illness, coughed into his hand, a faint, amused smile on his lips. He told Leo not to be fooled. A man as meticulous as Caleb didn't make enemies by accident. It wasn't Nathaniel Harrison he defended, but his latest favorite, a young, celebrated artist. Nathaniel's preference for beautiful young men was a poorly kept secret in their circle. There were even whispers about a past entanglement with the original Julian. They found the artist, red-faced and furious, while Caleb was being held down by two burly security guards. His face impassive as fists rained down on him. Julian approached, his voice deceptively mild, asking for an explanation. The artist, bristling with indignation, accused Caleb of theft and of daring to lay hands on him. He sneered, remarking that he'd heard Julian Thorne was unhinged, and it seemed his staff was just as ill-mannered. He threatened to report the incident to Nathaniel. Julian calmly straightened his cuffs and asked the artist what he believed would be an appropriate resolution. The young man, surprised by Julian's placid demeanor, blustered that Caleb's hands should be broken, that he should crawl and beg for forgiveness. Julian smiled thinly. He suggested breaking his legs as well, painting a vivid picture of the man dragging his bleeding limbs, choking on his own blood before he could even form an apology. Wouldn't that be more satisfying? The artist went pale. Julian stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder, his voice a soft, chilling whisper. He advised the young man that arrogance was a tool to be used wisely. He noted that one should always consider the owner before kicking a dog. Whether Caleb stole something was irrelevant. Even if he had, Julian mused, his smile turning cruel, what of it? No one disciplined his people but him. He leaned in, reminding the artist of the rumors about him and Nathaniel. The artist collapsed to the ground, shaking uncontrollably. In truth, Julian had never even met Senator Harrison, and the rumors were likely baseless. But they were useful. He wiped his hands on a silk handkerchief and dropped it at the artist's feet before turning to leave. Caleb's gaze had been fixed on him for an unknown amount of time. His dark eyes were like a vortex, pulling everything in. It was a different look than before. It was the look of a predator that had finally identified its true prey. It was thrillingly insane. Julian strode over, seizing Caleb's jaw and forcing their eyes to meet. He noted coldly that a few days of leniency seemed to have made Caleb forget who was master. He ordered him to follow. The chill of the evening air, combined with the lingering effects of the last poisoning attempt, left Julian unsteady. Back in his study, he collapsed into a large leather armchair, his face ashen. He looked at Caleb and gave two commands. Kneel, and take off your clothes. Caleb stared at him, his eyes filled with an emotion Julian couldn't decipher. Then he moved, not to kneel but towards Julian. He braced his arms on the desk, caging Julian in. For the first time, he let the raw, feral intensity within him show, unfiltered. It was as if he was truly seeing Julian for the first time. The meaning in his gaze was unmistakable, and for a fleeting, absurd moment, Julian felt like a cornered animal. He dismissed the thought. He asked if this was a new form of torment. Caleb's voice was a low growl. He wouldn't dare. But he didn't move. He slowly began to unbutton his shirt, his eyes never leaving Julian's. The man was a canvas of well-defined muscle and scarred tissue, a testament to his resilience. He hadn't even flinched when the artist's men had beaten him. Julian realized then it had all been a test for him. He propped his head on his hand, affecting a look of bored disdain. He allowed the insolent gaze to roam over him before Caleb finally broke eye contact and knelt. Julian scoffed internally. He accused Caleb of staging the entire scene just to gauge his reaction. Caleb didn't deny it. Instead, he asked why, if Julian knew, he had bothered to save him. Julian's reply was a cold sneer, telling him not to flatter himself. Caleb's entire demeanor had shifted. The carefully constructed facade of a subservient man was gone, replaced by a lazy, predatory confidence. The oppressive aura he usually kept contained was now fully unleashed. He asked why Julian still saved him, even knowing he was the one who had tried to poison him. He confessed that he'd been suspicious from the beginning. Julian was not a man known for his mercy, yet his punishments had always been just shy of lethal. As if he wanted to push Caleb to the edge but couldn't bring himself to deliver the final blow. It was, Caleb concluded, incredibly dull. The beast had shown its teeth, not because it couldn't hide them, but because it no longer wanted to. He didn't fear Julian. He was studying him. A surge of anger propelled Julian from his chair. He kicked Caleb hard in the chest, ordering him to kneel further away. The smell of blood on him was disgusting. Caleb didn't even flinch. He asked what Julian would do later if he couldn't stand it now. Even knowing he meant future injuries, the phrasing was dangerously ambiguous. The room fell into a heavy silence. Leo entered with a tray of medication. His hand trembling so badly, he nearly dropped the bowl. If it weren't for the bottomless darkness in Caleb's eyes, Julian might have thought he knew he was speaking to a different soul inside this body. A cold smile touched Julian's lips. He found this all so boring. He picked up a bowl of soup, and with a flick of his wrist, sent it shattering on the marble floor. He told Caleb, in a voice dripping with contempt, that since he hadn't eaten, he could have this. He ordered him to crawl over and eat. Caleb watched him, his expression unreadable. Then he began to move, dragging his knees across the floor. Shards of porcelain bit into his flesh, drawing blood, but he gave no sign of pain. Julian's voice was a soft whisper. He asked if it hurt. Caleb's reply was a rote thank you for the meal. Julian's smile widened. He pressed his fingers into one of the bleeding cuts on Caleb's knee, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur. He guessed that right now, Caleb wanted to kill him more than anything. A tremor went through Caleb's body. He rasped that he wouldn't dare. Julian leaned in, his lips brushing Caleb's ear. He whispered that if Caleb didn't kill him, then he would have to kill Caleb. He patted his cheek and rose, telling him to think it over. Long after Julian left, Caleb finally stood. He methodically pulled the shards from his knees, his face a mask of stone. He spoke a single word into the shadows. From a corner that seemed to merge with the darkness, a man appeared, kneeling respectfully. It was the quiet physician who frequently visited the estate to treat Caleb. He addressed Caleb as his lord, reporting that the matter with Senator Harrison's son had been handled. A few days later, Nathaniel Harrison arrived at the estate. Julian greeted him with a shallow nod. The senator's son, far from being angry, simply smiled, a warm, disarming gesture. He chided Julian for being so formal. Julian felt a flicker of unease. Perhaps the rumors about the original Julian and Nathaniel weren't entirely baseless. He maintained a polite distance, offering a vague apology for the incident with the artist. Nathaniel waved it away, draping an arm around Julian's shoulders, his tone becoming intimate. He told Julian such things didn't matter between them. Julian subtly pulled away, asking what had brought him here. Nathaniel explained that his father had acquired a rare artifact and was hosting a gala. Then, his voice dropped, his eyes gleaming with a strange, distorted light. He promised Julian that he would soon take care of that matter for him, telling him to just wait a little longer. Julian pressed for clarification. Nathaniel's expression twisted with a secret, manic energy. He vowed that everyone who had ever looked down on him would pay. He would sit in the most powerful seat in the country, and Julian would be there with him. He then tried to placate Julian about the artist, claiming it was just a ploy to make him jealous. Julian had no interest in the twisted psychodrama of his predecessor. He gave a non-committal nod, but Nathaniel grew frantic, grabbing his hand. He asked if Julian hadn't missed him. Julian took a deep breath and stared at him with cold fury, telling him he was asking for death. The next second, Nathaniel was flying through the air, landing with a splash in the decorative fountain. Leaning against a marble pillar, arms crossed, was Caleb. His presence was an insolent, unapologetic statement. The cold spray had soaked through Julian's clothes, and a violent shiver racked his body. He glared at Caleb, asking what new brand of insanity this was. Caleb's eyes flickered to Julian's wrist, still bearing the faint imprint of Nathaniel's grip. He stated in a low, possessive tone that his master was always being bothered by other men. Always. The accusation was absurd. If anyone was a magnet for unwanted attention, it was Caleb. Julian, in this frail, sickly body, was practically a ghost. A sudden gust of wind made him tremble again. A heavy cashmere coat was draped over his shoulders, and Caleb's hands fastened the collar. His touch lingered as he murmured that his master's clothes were wet. Julian, annoyed, turned to leave, ordering Caleb to fish the senator's son out of the water. He hadn't finished reprimanding Caleb for his audacity when he was suddenly swept off his feet. He gasped, panicked and enraged, demanding to know what Caleb was doing. Caleb ignored him, his strides long and even. Julian struggled, calling him a damn animal. Caleb's voice was calm and steady by his ear. He advised his master to hold still. It would be a shame if such a precious body were to be damaged in a fall. The sarcasm was thick. Julian swore at him, but Caleb simply kicked open the bedroom door and gave him a light, stinging smack on his rear, telling him to behave. The moment he was dropped onto the bed, Julian lunged, grabbing Caleb's collar. He seethed that the little beast was trying to get himself killed. Caleb simply looked down at him, then methodically pried his fingers open, one by one. He loomed over him, his voice a low rumble. He asked if this wasn't what his master wanted. To be killed by him. That had been the goal. But this was different. Julian kicked him off, planting his foot on Caleb's chest. He snarled that permission to kill him was not permission to climb on top of him. Caleb received another 20 lashes. He was pale, a sheen of sweat on his forehead, clearly in agony. And yet, he still hadn't made his move. Julian decided to force the issue. He dismissed everyone from the room and summoned Caleb, who knelt before him, the picture of obedience. Julian tossed a dagger at his feet. The command was simple. Kill me. A flicker of something, anger, perhaps, crossed Caleb's face. He asked why. Julian's patience was wearing thin. He stated that Caleb was the only one whose hand he would willingly die by. The cannon fodder villain could only be killed by the protagonist. The hostile energy in Caleb's eyes suddenly vanished, replaced by an unreadable emotion. He looked at Julian as if finally understanding a great, terrible secret. He picked up the dagger, running a thumb almost casually along the razor-sharp edge. The next moment, the cold steel was pressed against Julian's throat. This was it. A sense of profound relief washed over him. But instead of a clean cut, he felt a sharp, searing pain as Caleb's teeth sank into the side of his neck. A strangled cry escaped him. This was not the death he had envisioned. He struggled, but Caleb held him fast with one hand, the other covering his mouth. His voice was a harsh, muffled command to be quiet. It felt like an eternity before the pressure finally eased. The fragile skin of his neck was broken, throbbing with a deep, humiliating pain. His clothes were in disarray, his wrists red from the struggle. He scrambled back, a feeling of violation and fear, emotions he hadn't felt in years, overwhelming him. The sensation of being claimed like an animal by a predator was viscerally real. Fury took over, and he slapped Caleb across the face, his voice shaking as he accused him of having a death wish. Caleb worked his jaw, the darkness in his eyes now a churning, tangible thing. Julian could see a raw, terrifying excitement in his gaze. After a long moment, Caleb lowered his head. He apologized, claiming he had gotten carried away. Julian, trembling with rage, began throwing anything he could reach at him, ordering him to go and receive his punishment. The bullwhip. At the door, Caleb paused. Julian was furiously examining the livid bite mark in a hand mirror. Caleb's throat worked. He told his master to calm down, promising to make amends when he returned. Julian hurled a porcelain teacup at his head, screaming at him to get out. Caleb was bedridden for 2 weeks this time. The physician came and went. Gifts from Nathaniel arrived daily and were refused without exception. Julian sensed an unhealthy obsession from the senator's son, a fixation on the person Julian used to be. The inevitable confrontation came at the senator's gala. He would have to see him there. He debated who to bring. Leo eagerly volunteered, but Caleb, still recovering, spoke up from the corner, his voice quiet but firm, insisting he could serve his master well. Julian shot him a glare, asking if he planned to serve him with his teeth. After some thought, he decided on Caleb. More proximity meant more opportunities for Caleb to fulfill his purpose. On the day of the gala, Caleb draped a heavy fur-lined cloak over Julian's shoulders. Julian immediately complained it was too hot. Caleb insisted, his voice low, that the outside air was frigid and it wouldn't do for him to get sick. Julian's scowl deepened. He ordered Leo to take it off, but Leo sided with Caleb, citing Julian's delicate health. Julian snapped, asking if a little fresh air was going to kill him. This fragile body couldn't live properly, but it couldn't die either. It was infuriating. Caleb chuckled softly, a twinkle in his eye. He made a deal. Julian would wear it until they arrived and he could take it off then. Julian glared, remarking that Caleb always got his way. Caleb agreed smoothly, adding that he expected a reward. Julian scoffed. In his dreams, Leo watched them, a confused expression on his face, wondering aloud when their relationship had gotten so good. Julian froze. Good relationship? Leo, feeling left out, began to whine about being left behind. Julian, overwhelmed, rubbed the young man's head and reluctantly agreed to let him come. As they left, Caleb brushed against Julian's wrist and whispered, his warm breath tickling his ear, asking if his master made a habit of charming people so indiscriminately. Julian gave him a look of disbelief, asking if he was insane. The senator's great treasure turned out to be nothing more than a new, experimental serum, supposedly for longevity. The old man, his mind clouded by age and ambition, couldn't distinguish between a panacea and poison. He proudly displayed it to his fawning guests. Julian sat in bored silence, listening to the sycophantic praise. Caleb, standing behind him, quietly warned him that the spirits served at these functions were strong, and he should drink sparingly. Without turning, Julian told him he was becoming increasingly presumptuous. A moment later, Caleb spoke again, asking if his master preferred to be carried on his back or in his arms. Julian slammed his glass down, asking through gritted teeth if he was drunk already. Caleb's reply was immediate. He preferred to carry him. He said his master's body was soft and felt good held in his arms, speculating that he might even wrap his arms around his neck. Julian hissed for him to shut up, pushing his drink away. Nathaniel approached, his eyes fixed on Julian. He explained his recent absence by claiming he'd been ill. He sat beside Julian, asking if he was still angry about the artist, insisting again it had been a ploy to get his attention. Julian mentally tuned him out. All the while, he could feel Caleb's gaze on him, a heavy, possessive weight. He cursed the unruly wolf cub under his breath. A sudden scream shattered the delicate peace. The senator had collapsed. In the ensuing chaos, Julian saw the man was not merely unconscious. He was convulsing, foaming at the mouth, his lips turning a deep shade of purple. Nathaniel stared at his father, a slow, horrifying smile spreading across his face. He whispered that it actually worked. The divine medicine. A terrible premonition seized Julian. He grabbed Nathaniel, demanding to know where he had gotten the serum. But Nathaniel was lost in his own world, laughing like a madman. Julian whipped his head around, only to find the spot where Caleb had been standing was empty. He had vanished in the confusion. Caleb. He had provided the fatal medicine to Nathaniel, arranged for Leo to be called away, and then slipped out unnoticed. All his talk about being carried. The ungrateful, backstabbing wolf. Julian grabbed Leo and hissed at him to get them back to the estate. But it was too late. Soldiers flooded the hall, sealing every exit. Nathaniel slowly rose, pulling a sword from the nearest soldier's sheath. He stumbled towards his father's body and began to stab it, again and again, a gruesome, frantic display that filled the air with the coppery scent of blood. Then he turned, his wild, blood-soaked gaze finding Julian. He beckoned him over. An almost physical wave of revulsion washed over Julian. Nathaniel grabbed his hand, his touch slick and warm, asking if he was still angry, assuring him the artist was long dead. He said the old man was dead now, too. His head hurt so much. He begged Julian to stay with him just like they used to. He was insane. He looked at the terrified crowd and asked Julian if he should kill them all, to put his mind at ease. When one of the officials began to scream obscenities at him, Nathaniel ran him through without a second glance. Then he looked back at Julian, his expression pleading. He just wanted to know what Julian wanted him to do. Julian closed his eyes, stating quietly that he disliked the smell of blood. Nathaniel smiled gently. Julian was kept in a lavishly appointed suite within the Harrison compound. He never imagined being the subject of a deranged man's obsession. Nathaniel's feeling for the original Julian wasn't love. It was a pathological dependency born from shared trauma and loneliness. His own chronic migraines were only soothed by Julian's presence. Over time, that dependency had curdled into what he mistook for love. A month after seizing power, Nathaniel's reign was a bloodbath. He brutally executed his siblings and any dissenting officials. The country was in turmoil. One evening, as Julian stared at his reflection in a lily pond, a second figure appeared in the water. A hand clamped over his mouth, and a strong arm pulled him back into the shadows. A familiar low voice murmured by his ear. It was him. Julian's heart went cold. So the great savior had arrived. A month had sharpened Caleb's edges, his presence now heavier, more commanding. He looked down at Julian, his dark eyes bottomless. He chided him for always lingering in dangerous places. He seemed to remember himself and released his grip, explaining that he had been overeager after their long separation. Julian wiped his mouth, his gaze like ice. He remarked on Caleb's skill, entering the compound so easily. Caleb's thumb brushed his cheek. He said softly that Nathaniel had stolen something of his. He had to get it back. Julian understood. He wanted the throne. He pushed Caleb away, telling him to do as he pleased. Caleb followed, grabbing his arm, his voice strained. He asked if Julian was angry. Julian looked at him, genuinely confused, asking why he would be. Caleb slammed him against the wall, his body caging him in. So this was it. Caleb thought he could control him now, that Julian's life was a bargaining chip. He whispered that when he first realized Julian wanted to die, and only by his hand, he had been thrilled. It meant no one else could ever control his fate. It meant Julian would look at no one but him. His eyes, dark with a palpable desire, roamed Julian's body. He lifted Julian's leg, hooking it around his waist, his voice thick and hoarse. He begged him not to be angry. He promised him anything, the throne, the world, if he would just ask for it. As he leaned in to kiss him, Julian's voice cut through the haze, cold and sharp. He asked if this whole elaborate scheme was just for this. Caleb froze. Julian continued, his voice relentless. A servant who disobeys, who flees in chaos, who repeatedly deceives his master. He deduced that Caleb had only tolerated his abuse because the Thorn estate was the perfect base of operations to communicate with his hidden army. He pinpointed the messenger, the quiet physician, who delivered not just medicine, but intelligence. Caleb's eyes widened in disbelief. Julian told him that he knew more than he could possibly imagine. He advised him that if he wanted to please his master, he should learn some humility. He had no interest in things offered so crudely. He threatened to cut off the part of him currently pressing against his thigh and feed it to the dogs if he ever tried to pounce on him again. He then ordered him to put his leg down. Caleb swallowed hard, his eyes a storm of dark emotions. He slowly straightened up and knelt, head bowed, looking like an abandoned dog. Julian tilted his chin up, his voice dangerously soft. For having such thoughts about his master, he said Caleb was incredibly bold. Caleb apologized. A playful cruelty sparked in Julian. He toyed with a lock of Caleb's hair, watching as his eyes followed the movement. Then he yanked it hard. He asked what his punishment should be. Caleb grunted in pain, his lips pressed into a thin line. Whatever his master decided, he would accept. Julian's fingers traced a path down his chest, his voice a silken whisper. He asked Caleb if he was a pervert. The man's handsome face was a mask of Renai, his eyes churning with suppressed turmoil. Julian stepped back, abruptly withdrawing his hand. He had lost interest. He told Caleb to entertain himself. For a moment, Caleb's face was a picture of stunned bewilderment. Julian found it almost cute. He announced he was leaving, as someone was waiting for him. Caleb grabbed him, his grip like iron, his teeth grazing his wrist. His voice was raw. He asked if his master had to provoke him. He insisted that Nathaniel was an incompetent dreamer who couldn't give Julian anything. Only he could. He begged Julian to choose him. He was a hair's breadth from losing control. The insolent, unrestrained animal. Julian hadn't seen Nathaniel in weeks. Caleb stared, his confusion giving him a brief moment of vulnerability that Julian enjoyed immensely. He explained the political situation. The country was in open revolt. The military was on the verge of mutiny after Nathaniel executed a beloved general's father. Did Caleb really think Nathaniel had time to bother with him? The person waiting for him was Leo. Caleb's eyes narrowed dangerously. Julian confirmed that yes, he had deliberately misled him. He leaned in close, whispering strategic advice. Find the disgruntled general, rally the troops. He gave him an old family signet, explaining it would grant him access to a network of contacts hidden outside the city. Caleb stared at the signet. He asked what would happen if he didn't return. Julian smiled slowly. "Then you'll be dead." Caleb's low chuckle echoed in the quiet room. He promised to deal with Nathaniel and return in a few days. Julian urged him to be quick. He was getting tired of being a prisoner. As he was leaving, Caleb paused. He said he had never, not for a second, thought of locking Julian up, or chaining him to a bed where no one else could see him. Never. Julian laughed, telling him to get lost. Caleb hesitated again. Julian knew what he wanted. He gave him a small reward, pulling him down for a brief, hard kiss. That seemed to satisfy him. But then he came back one last time, asking why Leo was visiting so late. "To bring dinner," Julian replied. He would leave right after. Caleb nodded, finally content, and disappeared into the night. True to his protagonist's nature, Caleb was ruthlessly efficient. Within a week, the rebellions coalesced into a unified force under his command. Nathaniel's regime crumbled. It was then that Nathaniel finally came for Julian. He was covered in blood, sword in hand, but he was smiling. He told Julian he'd just seen a ghost. Caleb, his old servant. He rambled, his mind clearly gone, about his father's ghost haunting him, about how he'd killed everyone who wouldn't obey. He pressed the tip of his sword to Julian's neck, drawing a thin line of blood. He asked Julian to die with him, reminding him of a promise the old Julian had made. Julian, feeling the sting of the blade, pulled out the dagger he had kept hidden. He hated tragic, clingy men, and he had no intention of being killed by anyone but Caleb. He told the new king to go on ahead. The fight was pathetic. This body was too weak, even against a man ravaged by madness and drugs. Staggering out of the room, covered in Nathaniel's blood, he heard the thunder of hooves. An army of black-clad soldiers stormed the compound. At their head was Caleb. The smile on his face vanished the moment he saw Julian. He launched himself from his horse, pulling Julian into a crushing embrace, his entire body shaking. Julian, struggling to breathe, managed to raise a hand and mess up his perfectly styled hair. "It's not my blood," he rasped. "Let go." He was forced into a month of bed rest. Leo wept when he saw him, vowing never to leave his side again. The physician, now revealed as Caleb's confidant, brewed bitter medicines that worked wonders. After a month, Julian felt better than he had in years, but the medicine kept coming. He looked at the black, foul-smelling liquid and then at the stone-faced physician, asking if this was some form of revenge. The man's composure cracked for a second. He insisted he was only following his master's orders to ensure a swift recovery. Julian offered a deal. If he let him stop the medicine, he'd allow Leo to visit him. The physician's single-word refusal was immediate. Julian just smiled. When Caleb heard, he rushed back from the capital that night. He admonished Julian, saying he couldn't stop his treatment when he wasn't fully recovered. Julian gave him a cool look, telling him that he'd recover much faster if Caleb would stop exhausting him. Caleb immediately fell silent. Soon after, Caleb's coronation was held. The young emperor stood, stoic and regal, as the nation's powerful bowed before him. But he had no love for the palace. In the week following the ceremony, he visited Julian's estate constantly. Julian was sunning himself in the garden, eyes closed, as Caleb peeled a grape for him. He tried to tempt him with descriptions of the new flowers in the palace garden, of the enormous koi in the imperial pond. Julian refused, claiming he was too tired. A moment later, he was airborne. He yelped, instinctively clinging to Caleb, then immediately began cursing him, threatening to kill him if he dared to abduct him and take him to the palace. Caleb silenced him with a kiss, his tone half-joking. If he killed him, he'd have no one. Did he want to be a widow? Julian was stunned into silence by the shameless, blunt remark. He struggled, insisting he would not go to the palace, that he was tired of being medicated day and night. Caleb shushed him, his voice softening, begging his master to take pity on him. Julian glared. Caleb had no right to pity. He always got what he wanted. Caleb's expression turned somber, his dark eyes pleading. He asked Julian to be kind to him. The face was just too perfect, the appeal too direct. Julian sighed, then covered the handsome face with his hand, telling him not to use his looks to seduce him. A laugh escaped Caleb as he hugged him tighter. He had forcibly inserted himself into Julian's quiet, monotonous life, painting it with bold, chaotic colors. Julian hadn't abandoned his original goal. If one day Caleb decided to kill him, he would gladly offer his neck. But until then, the wait for death was dreadfully boring. And he was not a man who could bear loneliness for long. As their figures retreated towards the waiting car, their laughter melted into the soft morning mist. The air was clear, the sun was bright, and the new reign promised to be long and prosperous.